He was born into a world where certainty seemed guaranteed. As the Queen's second son, Prince Andrew grew up inside a system built on continuity, red boxes, state visits, balcony appearances, and the quiet assurance that duty and privilege would always move in step. The image was clear: a prince of the House of Windsor, shaped by service, surrounded by ceremony, anchored by history. Today, that image sits uneasily beside the life he now leads. The man who once stood at the centre of royal processions is largely absent from public engagements. The prince who represented the crown abroad now moves mostly within private boundaries. What was once a confident public role has become a carefully contained existence, lived at a distance from the formal life of the institution that defined him. This contrast is more than symbolic. For years, Andrew moved in circles where introductions were effortless and access was taken for granted. The privileges of birth opened doors, created networks, and blurred the line between personal life and public role. Yet as scrutiny intensified and standards shifted, that same proximity to power drew a very different kind of attention. The structures that once shielded him began to recede. Official duties were stepped back. Patronages were handed on. The language surrounding his position changed, from active to former, from central to peripheral. A prince who once embodied the assurance of monarchy now stands as a reminder that even within the royal household, consequence has a reach of its own. This documentary begins in that uneasy space. A life formed by royal certainty now exists in a kind of managed quiet. The question that follows is simple but unsettling. What does it mean when a member of the royal family discovers that the protections of privilege no longer extend as far as they once did? There was a time when Prince Andrew's public story was one of promise, service, and visibility. In the early years, he appeared as a modern answer to an ancient institution. A young man in uniform, a prince prepared to serve not only by birthright, but by active duty. His naval career, particularly his role during the Falklands conflict, became a defining chapter. Images of a helicopter pilot operating in a live theatre of war lent weight to the notion of a working prince, not merely a ceremonial figure. For many, those years forged an impression that would endure. A man who had faced risk, worn service fatigues, and contributed to a national effort. The formalities of royal life, state banquets, investitures, diplomatic tours, were layered over a narrative of courage that resonated in households far beyond palace walls. His marriage to Sarah Ferguson in 1986 added a different texture to that story. Their wedding, watched by millions, seemed to signal a lighter, more accessible chapter for the monarchy. The couple projected warmth and spontaneity, their laughter and informal manner offering a counterpoint to more traditional royal images. For a period, they appeared to embody a modern, approachable face of the crown, a young family navigating duty with visible affection. The arrival of Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie deepened this perception. Public photographs and carefully managed appearances presented Andrew as an engaged father, smiling at school events, walking with his daughters at public occasions, sharing brief glimpses of an ordinary tenderness within an extraordinary setting. It was a role in which he seemed comfortable, and one that would remain central to how those close to him describe him. Beyond the domestic frame, Andrew's international role grew. As a royal representative on trade missions and diplomatic visits, he attended conferences, met business leaders, and appeared at events designed to promote British interests overseas. His presence signalled the Crown's endorsement, lending ceremonial and symbolic weight to commercial and diplomatic endeavours. Yet within this carefully maintained image, a quieter tension was already present. The networks that underpinned his work, corridors of business, finance, and private influence, were complex. Access flowed in both directions. Invitations, introductions, and relationships formed in these spaces did not always sit neatly within the traditional expectations of a working royal. In hindsight, the confidence that once read as assured begins to look less certain. The same ease with which he navigated elite circles would later be reassessed through a more critical lens. Decisions that seemed unremarkable at the time now appear as early markers of a deeper question. Where did the duties of a prince end, and where did a more personal pursuit of opportunity begin? From a distance, those earlier years carry a faint air of nostalgia, a snapshot of a role that felt secure, framed by uniforms, ceremonies, and an assumption of permanence. But that security, we now know, was more fragile than it appeared. The image he once held has not disappeared. It has simply been overtaken by what came after. Long before the most visible turning points, there were early signs that Prince Andrew's position was shifting. On official schedules, engagements grew fewer. The tone of coverage altered, moving from celebratory to cautious, then quietly questioning. The narrative was no longer driven purely by honours and appearances, but by a growing interest in the networks that surrounded him. As the public sphere changed, expectations around transparency evolved with it. Political life, corporate governance, and charitable sectors all came under sharper scrutiny. In that climate, the movements of a senior royal, particularly one closely associated with business figures and private wealth, inevitably drew attention. Reports began to highlight his proximity to powerful individuals whose interests did not always sit comfortably within the familiar landscape of royal duty. Financial pressures added another layer. Maintaining a residence such as Royal Lodge, sustaining staff, and upholding the lifestyle expected of a prince, even one not at the very centre of succession, required substantial resources. Over the years, accounts and commentary pointed to a reliance on private arrangements and benefactors to bridge the gap between formal support and personal expenditure. These were not always unusual in themselves, but collectively they suggested a growing dependence on relationships outside the clear structures of the crown. Within the walls of Royal Lodge, life appeared settled. The house offered continuity, routine, and a degree of insulation from the shifting winds beyond Windsor. Sarah Ferguson's continued presence, though unofficial, brought familiarity and a sense of shared history. For friends and visitors, it was a domestic environment that seemed to defy the usual patterns of royal separation. Divorced, yet intertwined. Formally apart, yet practically aligned. But the very elements that made this arrangement comfortable also complicated his position. The overlap between personal loyalty, financial arrangements, and public identity became increasingly difficult to untangle. As questions about judgement emerged, they did not focus solely on any single decision, but on a pattern, a constellation of associations, favours, and introductions that blurred the boundary between a prince fulfilling duties and a man pursuing his own networks. Inside the institution, such patterns carry weight. The monarchy depends not only on what its members do, but on how that behaviour is perceived. Any suggestion of unpredictability or opaque relationships risks unsettling the careful balance on which public trust rests. Andrew's choices, viewed cumulatively, posed a challenge. How could the Crown maintain confidence in an individual whose judgment appeared increasingly at odds with the caution required of his position? The response was gradual rather than dramatic. Engagements were reduced, his role was quietly recalibrated. Conversations took place, away from cameras and microphones, behind closed doors in Buckingham Palace offices, where calendars, responsibilities, and long-term expectations are quietly redrawn. From the outside, it looked like a slow dimming of the lights. From the inside, it was the early phase of something more consequential. A recognition that the prince who once embodied vigour now introduced uncertainty. The decline was not yet obvious to the wider public, but its trajectory was already set. In the wake of his withdrawal from public duties, Prince Andrew's world narrowed. The sudden absence of official engagements, state occasions, and ceremonial obligations created a quiet that was striking in its contrast to the rhythm of his former life. Where once diaries were filled with visits, briefings, and travel, they now reflected a far more limited existence, centred not on the public stage, but on the private grounds of Royal Lodge. The estate, set on the edge of Windsor Great Park, became both a physical and symbolic boundary. Geographically close to the heart of the monarchy, it remained emotionally and institutionally distant from the formal programme of royal activity. Major events continued, trooping the colour, state visits, jubilees, and later the accession of King Charles III. But they did so without his presence in the roles he might once have held. Institutionally, the monarchy moved with careful pragmatism. A streamlined vision under the new reign placed emphasis on clarity, duty, and public trust. Within that framework, there was little room for ambiguity about Andrew's position. He was not exiled in any formal sense, nor removed from the family itself, but his role was decisively constrained. The message was clear, his circumstances were acknowledged, his return to frontline duties was not anticipated. Within the family, the dynamics were more nuanced. Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie continued to demonstrate personal loyalty, attending private gatherings, speaking of their father with affection, and maintaining a relationship rooted in shared history rather than public role. Sarah Ferguson remained a familiar presence, her long-standing bond with Andrew offering continuity, companionship, and a sense of domestic normality within the grounds of Royal Lodge. Yet these personal connections did not translate into institutional rehabilitation. They could not. The monarchy's broader responsibility to the public required distance, not reintegration. Appearances involving Andrew were rare, often limited to private or semi-private contexts, and carefully managed when they did occur. The aim was not to erase him from existence, but to ensure that his circumstances did not overshadow the work of the Crown. Financial and practical questions persisted in the background. The future of properties, the structure of support, and the long-term implications of maintaining his residence remained subjects of discussion and media interest. While the details were often opaque, the broader impression was of a life maintained within clear constraints, secure in some respects, but sharply limited in scope and purpose. For Andrew himself, this period represents an extended aftermath. A life without the public identity that once defined him, lived in proximity to an institution that has moved on. Days that might previously have been measured in ceremonies and audiences are now marked by a quieter routine. Private meetings, family contact, and the subdued rhythms of a life withdrawn from the spotlight. The isolation is not absolute, but it is unmistakable. It reflects a settlement of sorts between individual and institution. He remains a prince by birth, but his future, as far as public life is concerned, appears to have been decided. Prince Andrew's story now sits at an uneasy intersection between past and present, between an older understanding of royal immunity and a newer insistence on accountability. His trajectory, from celebrated naval officer and visible working royal to a figure largely withdrawn from public view, traces not only personal choices, but a wider shift in what society expects from those who hold inherited power. In previous generations, such a reckoning might have been managed quietly, contained within palace walls, mediated through carefully drafted statements and limited information. Today, that is no longer possible. The public sphere, driven by media scrutiny and a more assertive sense of civic expectation, demands transparency in a way that even senior royals cannot entirely avoid. Andrew's experience illustrates how swiftly the ground can move beneath someone whose position once seemed unshakable. It is tempting to view his story solely as a cautionary tale about misjudgment. There is truth in that reading. Decisions made over years, of association, of access, of trust, have consequences that cannot be undone by statements or interviews. Yet to stop there would be to miss another dimension, the human reality of a man who has seen his role, identity and future reshaped in ways he may never have anticipated. Those who know him speak of a devoted father, a man with genuine affection for his daughters, and a continuing reliance on the companionship of Sarah Ferguson. These relationships endure, even as the public role that once surrounded them has receded. Within the Royal Lodge, life goes on in small, ordinary ways. Conversations over meals, shared family moments, routines that have little to do with the grand narratives of monarchy. For the institution, the lessons are stark. The Crown's survival depends not on the invulnerability of its members, but on its capacity to respond when standards are tested. In choosing distance over reinstatement, the monarchy has signalled that the expectations placed upon it by the public cannot be lightly set aside. Privilege alone is no longer enough. Alignment with contemporary values is essential. In the end, Andrew's story becomes part of a larger question about the future of the British monarchy. Can an institution built on tradition continue to command respect in a society that insists on accountability? What happens when the personal conduct of one member threatens the credibility of the whole? And how should the balance be struck between private humanity and public responsibility? There are no easy answers. What remains is a quiet image. A single residence on the edge of Windsor Great Park, lights glowing softly behind its windows as evening falls. Inside lives a man who once moved at the centre of royal life, now adjusting to a reality defined by limits rather than invitations. It is a reminder that even within the most established institutions, certainty is not guaranteed, and that in the modern age, consequence reaches further than title. Every unfolding story has a point at which private concern becomes a public crisis. For Prince Andrew, that point arrived in the form of a televised interview that quickly moved far beyond the usual boundaries of royal media. What had previously been dispersed across years of commentary and speculation was suddenly concentrated into one broadcast. A single conversation watched, replayed, and analysed across the world. The interview was intended, in part, to offer clarity. It aimed to address serious questions that had gathered around his judgement, associations, and understanding of responsibility. Instead, it exposed a striking gap between the gravity of those questions and the tone of his answers. For many viewers, the dissonance was immediate. Where they expected contrition, they heard an explanation. Where they looked for distance from controversy, they saw attempts to justify past decisions. In the hours and days that followed, reaction moved with rare speed. Commentators from across the political and media spectrum reached a remarkably similar conclusion. The appearance had not eased concern, it had amplified it. Editorials described it as one of the most consequential media moments in modern royal history. The interview became a reference point in its own right, a shorthand for a misjudgment played out in real time. Within the institution, the impact was equally stark. The monarchy, conscious of its duty to remain above personal controversy, recognised that the situation could no longer be managed quietly. Public confidence, already strained, now appeared at genuine risk. In response, formal steps were taken with unusual clarity and speed. Announcements followed confirming that Andrew would step back from public duties. Military roles and patronages were suspended or reassigned. The language surrounding his position changed almost overnight. For Andrew himself, the consequences were profound. The structures that had defined his adult life, official engagements, ceremonial responsibilities, foreign visits, were effectively dismantled. A role that once depended on visibility was replaced by a life lived largely out of sight. The title remained, the function did not. In that moment, decades of accumulated status confronted a modern reality. Public understanding of accountability had shifted, and the monarchy could not remain untouched by that shift. Whatever the complexities of the underlying story, the interview crystallised a simple conclusion in the minds of many, that a line had been crossed, and that returning to the previous status quo was no longer possible. From that point onwards, the prince was no longer discussed as a working member of the royal family, but as a figure whose position had been fundamentally altered. The narrative had changed, and with it, the future shape of his life within the institution.